There was something wrong with the voice on the other end of the call. It was hollow, distant, like a radio transmission bouncing off dead air. "You want real proof?" the voice asked. "The Santa Perdita appears off the coast of Isla de la Muerte. Midnight, full moons only, if you're brave enough." Then the line went dead. They had been out in Mexico on a chupacabra case, which had turned out to be a dud, and were sulking in their hotel room when they got the call. The ocean breeze rattled the window. "What do you think?" Josh asked, turning to Dave, who was already scrolling through his phone, looking up the name. "Never heard of it," Dave muttered. "But listen to this. Cargo ship. Set sail from Senegal in 1941, carrying exotic goods to Mexico before heading to New York. It disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, or so they said. But there are stories, real creepy shit. Locals claim it reappears on full moons drifting just off the coast. They say the crew never left." Josh exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He'd been chasing ghosts long enough to know that half the stories were bullshit. Old sailors' tales, internet horror stories, maybe some well-placed fog making a wreck look like something it wasn't. But something about this one felt different. There were no grainy YouTube videos, no overproduced Travel Channel specials, just whispers, faded news clippings, a ship lost to time, making its return. "Let's check it out," Josh said, grabbing his gear bag. By the time they reached the docks, the moon was rising, swollen and golden. The sea stretched out like black glass. The fisherman who had agreed to take them this far, an old man named Ernesto, refused to go any closer. "I won't go near the Santa Perdita," he said, crossing himself. "If she wants you, she'll take you." Josh and Dave climbed into their dinghy, engines humming as they motored toward open water. For a long time there was nothing, just rolling waves, the distant lights of the shore, the vast emptiness of the ocean. Then the mist came. It slithered over the waves, curling around the boat like fingers. The temperature dropped. The smell of rotting salt water filled their noses. And then there it was. The Santa Perdita loomed out of the fog, a skeletal behemoth of rust and decay. Her hull was encrusted with barnacles, her deck shadowed and silent. But she floated, impossibly intact. Josh grabbed the camera. "You getting this?" Dave didn't answer, because the moment they drifted alongside, the ship's floodlights blazed to life, searing into them like an open eye. And behind them their boat was gone. The Santa Perdita loomed over them, her floodlights cutting through the fog with unnatural intensity. The light was wrong, too bright, too white, like an interrogation lamp trained directly on their souls. Josh swallowed hard. He turned back, expecting to see their dinghy bobbing gently in the water. It was gone. "Dave," Josh whispered, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. "Where's the boat?" Dave spun in place, scanning the water. Just empty ocean, no boat, no sign of Ernesto either. This doesn't make sense," Dave said, gripping his camera. Josh sucked in a deep breath and forced himself to focus. This wasn't the first time something had tried to spook them. The best way to deal with fear was to push through it. "We have to board," he said. "We came for an investigation. We get the footage, document everything, and figure this out." "Yeah," Dave muttered. "Sure. Figure this out." They reached for the rusted ladder hanging over the ship's side, the metal corroded and slick with algae. It groaned beneath their weight as they climbed, every rung threatening to break free from its welds. The deck was worse up close. The Santa Perdita was no ghostly mirage. This was a corpse of a ship, rotting in real time. The air smelled of wet iron and decay. The wooden planks groaned beneath their boots, softened from decades of salt and sea. Josh raised his flashlight and swept it across the deck. No movement, but something wasn't right. The Santa Perdita had been adrift for nearly a century, yet the deck was clear. No accumulated debris, no mounds of bird droppings, no signs of long-abandoned nests, just stillness. And that god-awful smell. Dave let out a slow breath. "I don't like this, man." Josh didn't either, but the cameras were rolling, and fear never stopped them before. Then the floodlights flickered. One by one, the lights buzzed and died, plunging them into pure darkness. Josh's breath caught in his throat. The silence was worse than the dark. It was thick, a presence all its own pressing down on them, filling the space where sound should be. Then, drip. A single wet drip echoed from somewhere deep inside the ship. Josh turned to Dave, whose face was lit only by the glow of the camera screen. His mouth was slightly open, eyes wide, another drip, then a slow, sloshing step. Something was moving inside the ship, and it wasn't them. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate slosh, like a barefoot stepping into ankle-deep water. Josh's grip tightened on his flashlight. The beam shook as he aimed it toward the open stairwell leading below deck. Water shimmered at the bottom, black as ink. "I don't like this," Dave whispered. "Tell me you don't like this either." Josh swallowed, forcing a nod. But they were already in too deep. The Santa Perdita wasn't going to let them leave without giving them something. "We document," he said. "That's what we do." Dave sighed. "Yeah, until one of us ends up being the document." Still, he followed as Josh led the way down. The metal steps groaned beneath them, their boots splashing into cold, stagnant water as they reached the lower deck. The air was different here, heavier, thick with mildew and something else, something rotten. Josh swept his flashlight over the corridor. Pipes ran along the walls, sweating rust and condensation. The doors on either side were sealed shut, corroded over time. The only open path was forward, where the passage curved deeper into darkness. Then another sound, a ripple in the water. Josh stopped cold, raising his hand to silence Dave. The ripple spread, lapping against their boots. Something had disturbed it. Josh turned, shining his flashlight behind them. Nothing. Just empty hallway, silent and endless. They pressed on, their own movements cautious, each step sending gentle waves outward. Then ahead, the water trembled, like something had just moved through it. Dave's breathing quickened. "Josh!" Josh turned just as something slithered past the edge of his flashlight beam. He spun in place, aiming the light frantically, but there was nothing. The water was still again. Josh forced himself to breathe. "We keep going." Dave exhaled a nervous chuckle. "Yeah, 'cause that's always the right choice in horror movies." They waded deeper until the passage opened into what must have once been the crew's mess hall. Rusted tables and overturned chairs sat partially submerged, the water reflecting their warped shapes. Then another step. This time it wasn't distant, it was right behind them. Josh turned, flashlight raised. The water was still, but the walls weren't. Wet footprints, too many to count, were appearing along the walls and ceiling, stretching outward in all directions, like something had just walked through, dripping, unseen. Josh's throat went dry. Then in the far corner a door creaked open, and something inside was waiting. The door groaned wider, revealing only darkness beyond. Josh and Dave stood frozen, water lapping against their legs, their breath coming in short bursts. Then something moved inside, not a full shape, just a suggestion of motion, a shift in the blackness. Josh lifted his camera, the red recording light flickering weakly in the damp air. "We go in." Dave shot him a look like he'd lost his damn mind. "Josh, did you see the footprints on the ceiling?" "We came here for proof." "Yeah, well, we're about to get more proof than we can handle." But Josh was already stepping forward, forcing himself through the doorway. The air inside was different, heavier. The smell of brine and rot thickened, turning his stomach. His flashlight beam cut across the room, illuminating the wreckage of what had once been the captain's quarters. The wooden desk, bloated with seawater, sat in the center, its edges curling like burnt paper. An old map was pinned to the wall, the ink smeared and illegible, and on the desk sat an open logbook. Josh took another step, and something crunched under his boot. Bones. Small, delicate finger bones, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Dave cursed under his breath. Josh ignored him and approached the desk. The logbook's pages were brittle, crumbling at the edges, but the ink remained. He read the final entry aloud. "Water rising, no escape. The crew is gone, but I hear them. I hear them in the walls, I hear them in the water. The ship is moving, but there is no wind, there is no land. We are lost." Josh swallowed hard. The date, 1941. There was a pause, then Dave whispered, "Josh, look." Josh turned. A pen lay beside the logbook, a pen that hadn't been there a moment ago, and it was moving. It lifted on its own as if guided by an invisible hand, the tip pressing to the page, scraping, scratching. Josh and Dave watched in frozen horror as ink bled into the paper, forming two simple words. "You shouldn't be here." The pages flipped violently as if caught in a phantom wind. Their names were written on the next blank page. Josh stared at the ink, still wet, his pulse hammering. Then behind them the door slammed shut, and someone, sighed from the corner of the room. The sigh faded into the walls, a sound that shouldn't have existed yet had no trouble settling into their bones. Josh and Dave stood frozen in the captain's quarters, the damp logbook still open before them, their names freshly written on its ancient pages. Somewhere beyond the door, something was moving, not footsteps this time. A murmur, voices. Josh turned to Dave, and even in the dim light he could see the sweat on his friend's face. "We need to go," Dave said, voice barely above a whisper. Josh nodded. "Stay close." They moved quickly, wading back through the flooded corridor, the water swirling at their ankles. With every step the ship seemed to wake up around them. The pipes groaned. The walls expanded and contracted as if they were breathing. And then the murmurs became orders. Low, indistinct voices, spoken in hurried, clipped tones. Commands, like those given on a working vessel. But there was no crew. Josh and Dave reached the stairwell leading up to the main deck, their boots heavy with water. The light was different now, pulsing, flickering through the fog outside. The moment they stepped onto the deck, the voices stopped. Then the ship moved. Not a full lurch, but a shift, as if something deep within the hull had stirred. The deck vibrated beneath their feet, and then they saw it, the helm. What had been dark and empty before was now illuminated by an eerie, unnatural glow. The ship's wheel turned on its own, creaking against time and corrosion. Levers moved, rusted chains clanked, and the engine, dead for nearly a century, gave a faint, sputtering groan. Dave exhaled sharply. "Josh, we are not alone." Josh lifted his flashlight. The beam swept across the bridge's open doorway, and figures were inside. Crew members, not living, not entirely dead. They stood at their posts, heads bent over controls, working silently as if the ship were still sailing. Their uniforms were shredded, hanging from skeletal frames, their exposed flesh bloated and waterlogged. Their faces, what was left of them, were sunken, hollow-eyed. Then one of them turned, its empty gaze locked onto Josh and Dave, its mouth barely opening as if struggling to form words. Josh grabbed Dave's arm. "We have to go." But then from the far side of the bridge, a rusted radio crackled to life, and a voice, too clear, too modern, spoke through the static. "Josh, Dave, why did you come here?" The sound sent ice through Josh's veins. Dave took a step back. "That's not possible." The radio crackled again. "Leave, now." Then the ship's horn blasted, so loud, so violent, it rattled the metal beneath their feet. And all at once the figures turned to face them. The blast of the ship's horn vibrated through all their bones, deafening and oppressive, like it was trying to shake them loose from reality. Josh stumbled back, ears ringing, eyes locked on the figures at the helm. They weren't moving. Not yet. Their hollow, waterlogged faces were turned toward him and Dave, but they stood eerily still, as if waiting. Then the radio crackled again, a burst of static followed by labored breathing. "Mayday, Mayday, the ship is lost." The voice was ancient, distant, as if reaching them from another time. Dave sucked in a sharp breath. "Josh, that's a distress call." The radio whined, the dials rattling against rusted metal. "We are not alone. Repeat, we are not alone." The voice cut off, the static pulsing and shifting like something alive. And then, a new voice, crisp, clear, modern. "Josh, Dave." Josh's breath hitched. It knew their names. Dave's grip on the camera tightened. "Oh, hell no." The voice continued, calm and deliberate. "Why did you come here?" Then silence. Josh felt something cold curl around his stomach, twisting, pressing in against his ribs. This wasn't a recording. This wasn't a long-lost transmission trapped in the airwaves. Something here was speaking to them, something aware. The radio crackled once more. "Leave, now." Then the radio exploded, not just static, but a burst of sheer, deafening noise, like every signal in existence colliding at once. Sparks erupted from the console, and the entire ship lurched forward, metal groaning in protest. Josh and Dave were thrown off their feet. The figures at the helm still hadn't moved, but the ship was moving. Dave scrambled to his feet, pulling Josh up by the arm. "We need to get the hell out of here." Josh's pulse was hammering, his brain screaming at him to run, but his eyes flicked toward the control panel. The rusted, corroded levers were shifting on their own, pulling forward. The wheel turned slowly, guiding the ship. But to where? Josh didn't want to find out. They bolted from the bridge, their boots slamming against the deck. The fog had thickened, rolling in heavy waves across the ship, making the deck seem smaller, as if the ship was closing in on them. "Where's the damn ladder?" Dave barked, spinning in a panic. Josh shined his flashlight across the railing. The ladder was gone. Their way off the ship had vanished. Then through the fog, something slammed against the hull from the outside, a deep, powerful thud, then another. Dave turned toward the sound, dread thick in his voice. "Josh?" Josh followed his gaze toward the railing. The ocean wasn't empty anymore. Figures were standing on the water, and they were watching them. Josh couldn't breathe. The figures on the water weren't floating, they weren't swimming, they were standing, upright, motionless, their feet barely breaking the surface of the ocean. The fog curled around them, twisting in unnatural patterns, like the mist itself was alive and shifting between their legs. Their forms were indistinct at first, but as Josh's flashlight beam swept over them, details emerged. Tattered uniforms clung to bloated, waterlogged bodies. Their faces, where they had faces, were wrong. Their features washed out, hollow, as if seawater had eaten away at their flesh over decades. And their eyes were open. Empty sockets stared directly at Josh and Dave. They were waiting. The ship lurched again, its hull groaning like a wounded animal. The figures swayed slightly but did not move closer. Dave swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me you're seeing this." Josh nodded, gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles ached. "Yeah." The fog pulsed, rolling in heavier, thickening between them and the ocean, but the figures remained perfectly visible. Then something else shifted. The sky was wrong. Josh had to blink, shake his head. The stars. Where were the stars? The horizon, the coastline in the distance. It was gone. Instead, a storm was raging around them. Waves crashed against the ship, the wind howling, lightning splitting the darkness in sudden bursts of blue-white fury. Josh turned, expecting to feel the rain, but nothing touched his skin. His clothes were still dry. It wasn't real. The ship rocked violently, but not from the waves. It was something else, something pulling them, dragging them away from the shore. Dave grabbed Josh's arm, shaking him. "Our boat. Where's our damn boat?" Josh spun, scanning the deck, the endless fog pressing in on them, and there it was. Their boat was still tied to the ship, but someone was sitting in it. Josh's stomach turned ice cold. The figure was motionless, barely a shadow in the gloom, but he could see it, hunched forward, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening. Dave took a step forward, his breath hitching. "Josh." The ship groaned, and the storm around them flickered, like a bad signal cutting out. Suddenly the storm was gone. No waves, no wind, no thunder, just stillness. And the ocean was empty. No figures standing on the water. Scared, they raced towards the crew quarters and got inside, looking around fearfully, and saw nothing. They breathed a sigh of relief. But when Josh turned back toward the porthole window, his blood ran cold. Wet handprints covered the glass. Large hands, small hands, too many to count. A breathy voice drifted from beneath one of the bunks in the crew's quarters. "Lights out." And the door slammed shut. The door slammed shut, sealing them inside the crew's quarters. Josh spun, his flashlight beam flickering against the rusted metal walls. Dave was already grabbing the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. Something wanted them here. Josh's mind was still reeling from what they'd just seen, the figures standing on the water, the storm that wasn't real, the boat waiting for them, but not empty. And now the handprints on the porthole. They weren't just smears of moisture. They were still wet, dripping, as if something had pressed its fingers to the glass seconds ago. Dave's breathing was ragged. "Josh, what the hell is happening?" Josh had no answer. The ship was changing around them. He felt it. Like the Santa Perdita was waking up, shaking off decades of decay, remembering its crew. And it wanted new passengers. Josh forced his voice steady. "We need to get out of here. There has to be another way." Dave turned back to the door, bracing himself. "On 3, Josh nodded. 1. They planted their feet. 2. They sucked in breath. 3. They slammed into the door. It flew open, too easily, like someone had opened it for them. They stumbled into the hall, nearly falling into the flooded lower deck. The water was deeper now, reaching their knees. Josh barely had time to register this before he saw the chains. A rusted, padlocked door stood to their left, covered in chains that looked as though they had been wrapped by desperate hands. The door was different from the others. It wasn't rotting. It wasn't bloated with age. It was pristine. Josh shined his light on the metal, and words were scrawled across it in flaking paint. "Do not open." Dave groaned. "This is the part where we make the dumb decision, isn't it?" Josh didn't answer. He stepped closer. The chains were loose, no rusted locks, no tangled mess, just one sharp tug and it would come undone. It wanted them inside. Josh hesitated. "We don't have to." The ship lurched. The metal beneath them shuddered, and something deep inside the hull let out a low, rumbling moan. The chains snapped apart. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was untouched. No rust, no decay. The walls were smooth metal, polished and gleaming. The air smelled different, dry, like a place that had never known the sea, and in the center of the room, on a raised pedestal, was an ancient coffin. Not just any coffin. It looked Egyptian, but older, much older. Josh's flashlight flickered as he stepped inside. Beside the coffin, a skeleton was slumped against the wall, fingers still clutching a journal. Dave whispered, "Josh, we shouldn't be here." But Josh was already reaching for the journal, and then the lid of the coffin shifted. Something inside had heard them. Josh froze. The lid of the coffin had moved, not from decay, not from the shifting of the ship. Something inside had stirred. A deep, slow groan seeped through the air, not metal creaking, not the ship adjusting. This was breathing. Dave took a step back, eyes wide, his voice barely a whisper. "Josh, we need to leave." Josh didn't respond. He was staring at the journal in the skeleton's hands. It was old, leather-bound, cracked with time, but intact. The skeletal fingers curled around it, the bones yellowed with age. The ship groaned again, shifting beneath them. The lid of the coffin moved another inch. Josh snatched the journal and backed away. The breathing stopped. For a moment, silence. Then, the lid of the coffin slid completely off. Josh and Dave bolted. They splashed through the water, crashing into the hallway. Slipping on the rusted metal floor as the ship lurched again. Behind them, the chains that had once locked the door snapped back into place, slithering shut as if sealing something inside. Josh didn't look back. He didn't want to see what had been inside. They ran. The ship was changing around them now. The metal was twisting, doors shutting behind them, the water rising. The ship was trying to keep them there. Finally, they burst onto the main deck, gasping for breath. The fog was thicker, swirling like storm clouds around them. The air felt wrong, like something was pressing down on their lungs. Dave spun in place. "Where's the boat?" Josh turned. His stomach dropped. The boat was still there, but so was the figure sitting inside it. Josh and Dave went completely still. The figure was hunched forward, facing away from them. A low, dripping sound came from its body, like water spilling onto wood. Slowly, so painfully slowly, the figure began to turn its head. Josh couldn't move. Dave couldn't breathe. Then, the ship's horn blasted, louder than before, a deafening roar of sound that rattled their skulls. The fog pulsed, then vanished. The boat was empty. Their way off the ship was open. Josh didn't wait to question it. He grabbed Dave's arm and they ran, vaulting over the ship's railing and into the boat, untying it with trembling fingers. The moment their hands left the ship, the floodlights above them snapped off. The Santa Perdida was swallowed by darkness. Josh grabbed the camera, needing proof that any of this had happened. He fumbled with the footage, scrolling through the clips. His blood ran cold. Every shot, every frame, there was a third figure standing between them. A tall, skeletal man, his uniform rotted and soaked, his eyes locked directly on the camera. Dave gasped. "Josh?" Josh turned. The boat was empty, but the water beside them rippled. Something was still there. The water rippled. Josh and Dave sat frozen in the boat, breathless, waiting, listening. The Santa Perdida was gone, not faded into the fog, not drifting further away, just gone. One second, the enormous rusted hulk was towering behind them, and the next, nothing but empty ocean. Dave gripped the oars with white-knuckled hands, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't care how, I don't care why. We are leaving. Josh didn't argue. He couldn't. His mind was still racing, still trying to understand what they had just survived. The coffin, the thing inside it, the skeletal figure standing between them in every piece of footage. The figure in the boat that wasn't there anymore, and yet the ocean was not empty. The water around them pulsed with something unseen, something watching. The fog had disappeared, revealing the distant coastline, the safe, warm world of the living that felt impossibly far away. Dave rowed with everything he had. Neither of them spoke the entire way back. Hours later, back at the Beyond the Veil investigations office, they sat in the dark, still dripping with seawater, watching the footage over and over. Every frame confirmed the horror. They had not been alone. Somewhere between them, a tall, skeletal figure had been standing the entire time. It had been watching, waiting, and at the very end of the final clip, as they escaped in the boat, something shifted in the water behind them. A long, bony hand had broken the surface, reaching upward, curling its fingers as if waving goodbye. Josh exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. We released something, he muttered. That sarcophagus, that coffin wasn't supposed to be opened. Dave just stared at the screen, silent. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the computer and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then the office phone rang. Josh and Dave both jumped. It was past midnight. No one called this late. Josh hesitated, then picked up the receiver. Hello? A long, rasping breath answered him. Then a voice. Thank you. Josh's blood ran ice-cold. The voice was deep, ancient, filled with something unnatural. The same voice from the radio, from the ship, from the thing they had freed. Who is this? Josh managed, throat dry. A low chuckle crackled through the line. Then the voice whispered almost playfully, You set me free. The laugh that followed was inhuman, hollow, and filled with a cold, endless hunger. Then the line went dead. Josh dropped the phone like it had burned him, his pulse hammering in his ears. Dave swallowed hard, staring at him. Josh? Josh didn't answer, because somewhere, outside in the darkness, something was laughing. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.